Pacific Ocean, 1944. What started as a high-altitude patrol ended in fire that didn't wait for the ground to arrive. Lieutenant Jack Summer, piloting a P-38 Lightning, spotted them first. Two G4M Betty bombers flying low, razor-edged silhouettes chasing the curve of the sea. Fast, precise, deadly. They didn't move like targets. They moved like bullets with wings, on a mission, and already late for it. He dropped down with his wingman, banked hard. The engagement happened fast. No chatter, no warnings, just instinct. Summer's first burst of cannon fire streaked across the sky and clipped the underside of the lead bomber's right wing. And then it ignited. Not. Sparked, erupted like he'd hit a cache of gasoline, sitting just under the skin. Within seconds, the entire aircraft was a fireball. It didn't spin, didn't try to pull out, didn't even respond. The tail disintegrated mid-air. The fuselage became a rising furnace. A second later, it hit the ocean. There were no survivors. There was barely even wreckage. The second Betty banked violently, tried to turn back toward formation. It didn't make it far. A few rounds from the wingman punched through the fuselage. Another flare. Another plane swallowed before it fell. Back in radio contact, Summer muttered it to his squad. Mostly to himself. We barely touched it. But it lit up like someone poured gasoline into the whole damn thing. It wasn't luck. It wasn't overkill. And it wasn't the last time they'd see it. Again and again. In dogfights across the Pacific, Bettys would explode, not after barrages, but after a single, well-placed bullet. No self-sealing. No armor, no chance. Thus began the mystery. Why would Japan send its best crews to fly something that turned into a bomb the moment it was hit? A bomber designed to strike first, and never come home. Japan, 1937. Before the sky turned black, before the Pacific glowed with floating wreckage, before the name Betty became synonymous with fire, there was only a drafting table, a dream, and a deadline. Inside a quiet Mitsubishi design office near Nagoya, engineers worked late under humming lights, not rushed, not panicked, focused, determined. They pored over paper blueprints, stencil sheets, swept wing profiles drawn in sharp, calculated graphite. There was nothing warlike about the room, only urgency. The Imperial Japanese Navy had issued a bold directive: create a new type of bomber, capable of reaching the Pacific frontier and returning without a support fleet. It must carry heavy payloads and outfly any escort. In an era before air-to-air refueling, that demand wasn't just ambitious, it bordered on impossible. The only way to do it? Sacrifice. Lead designer Kiyoshi Ozawa, in a post-war interview, put it simply: range was sacred. Every extra kilometer we gained was a knife to Allied fleets. Armor? That was dead weight. Protection would only slow us down. And the faster we delivered death, the safer our crews would be. From the beginning, the Betty, officially designated the Mitsubishi G4M, was never designed to survive damage. It was built never to need to. Lightweight aluminum, skin, fixed gear, assembly, high-output twin engines. No armor plating. Fuel, tanks exposed and universally vulnerable, but it was fast. And it could deliver 2 torpedoes $3,000 kilometers away and return without refueling. A range almost unthinkable for a land-based bomber at the time. It skirted the edges of Pearl Harbor in simulations. It could reach the Philippines, strike carriers, and disappear, all without needing a nearby base. It was a weapon of reach, a dagger flung across oceans, and expected never to miss. On paper, it was perfect. On the drafting boards, it looked like a revolution in aerial warfare. In those early years, still before war had devoured half the globe, The Mitsubishi engineers believed what they were designing would end conflict quickly with knockout strikes, not drag men through years of fire and attrition. But the Pacific was patient, and so was reality. In their rush to create momentum, the creators of the Betty had authored something else. A bomber so lean, it had no room left for forgiveness. It would fly. It would strike. It would terrify. But it would never return flames unburned. South China Sea, December 10th, 1941. The sky was calm when the ghosts arrived. Across open water, 22 twin-engine silhouettes skimmed just above the horizon. Sleek, silent, deadly. The crews aboard the British battlecruiser Repulse and the battleship Prince of Wales saw little at first, just black dots, rising from ocean blue. Then came the sound, the rising pitch of twin Mitsubishi engines, torpedoes, slung low by Betty bombers built to strike from nowhere, built to never need a second pass. The Royal Navy, not yet reacquainted with air power's full potential, scrambled its defenses and opened fire. It didn't matter. In less than 2 hours, Japan had sunk both ships, modern, armored thunderbeasts of the British fleet. The Allies stood, stunned. Navies were supposed to dominate water. Now, they were being gutted from the sky. The Betty was a monster in the early war. It hit further, hit faster, disappeared where no fleet expected enemy. Bombers to reach without refueling. The Japanese brass saw it as a proof of doctrine, that range and aggression would always beat armor and hesitation. Betty crews, freshly returned from high-profile kills, were celebrated. "We are invincible in the air," one pilot said during a Tokyo parade. "The Betty will end this war quickly." They believed it, and for a time, so did everyone else. But the Pacific fights changed as months passed, and so did the kill ratio. As American aircraft entered the theater in real numbers, as P-38 Lightnings and F-4F Wildcats began dogfighting in the open skies between island campaigns, another truth rose with the ash. The Betty was fast, but it was made of paper. American pilots began reporting something strange. Unlike most bombers, which might limp home missing wings or engines, Bettys didn't limp. They either flew clean or disintegrated. Major Harry Morse, 339th Fighter Squadron, recalled his first Betty kill. "I fired 10 rounds into its left side. It went up like I'd dropped a match in a drum. I didn't feel clever. I felt sick. Survivors were rare. Escape hatches were blocked. Flames spread faster than gravity could give men time to jump." It wasn't long before pilots had a new name for them, the flying lighter. In briefing rooms from Bougainville to Tarawa, Bettys were referred to not by model number, but by flammability. You see one, don't let it get behind you, but if it's coming head-on, hit the tank, it'll light up halfway through your burst. Ironically, even German pilots in North Africa flying similar twin-engine bombers, like the Heinkel He-111 or the Junkers Ju-88, had better survival odds in comparable missions. Those aircraft were armored, slower, thicker-skinned. Their crews feared the enemy, yes, but weren't convinced they were flying suicide weapons. Japanese aviators weren't so sure. As more were captured or interrogated post-mission, American officers began hearing anonymized terror. "We are fast," one POW said, "but speed isn't armor." "We know," said another, "that if we are hit, we are done." The Betty offered touchdown range. It offered reach. But what it didn't offer was forgiveness. The kill ratio began to turn. From 1-1 in the early Pacific, now Americans taking on Betty formations could expect 2-1 or even 3-1 kill advantages, provided they struck first. One squad of 4 P-38s near Rabaul destroyed 8. Bettys before a single return shot landed, and those were bombers carrying elite strike crews. The American airmen stopped fearing the Betty's teeth. Instead, they feared wasting ammo, because these bombers only took one shot to vanish. It wasn't dominance by firepower. It was collapse due to design. What had once seemed indestructible was now a mass-produced funeral in the sky. The doctrine had worked, until it didn't. And when it failed with fire. Rabaul Airfield, October 12, 1942. Guadalcanal Operation. Night Raid. Dawn hadn't arrived yet, but the sun wasn't needed. Everyone on the airstrip knew what was coming. 6 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, prepped for a torpedo run on U.S. naval positions near Guadalcanal. The mechanics fueled the planes in silence. Arms loaded, radios checked, engines spun. Precision, calm, like clockwork in a funeral parlor. It wasn't the mission that made the air feel heavier. It was what everyone already knew. They weren't coming back. Inside the cockpit of aircraft Red 7, Flight Sergeant Tetsuo Nakamura slid his logbook into a side pouch, tucking it in like it mattered, like someone might read it someday. He looked over at the co-pilot, then to the tail gunner, a man half his age, eyes fixed on something in the dirt, a small brown pouch. Inside, a worn photo. His wife, pregnant, smiling, alive. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, squadron commander, walked the line between planes. No clipboard, no formal pep talk, no false fire. He ducked into each cockpit briefly. Quiet words, nods, final glances. When he reached Red 7, he placed a hand on Nakamura's shoulder and leaned, in voice low. Do not expect to return. Speed is your armor. Speed is your prayer. And then he moved on. Nakamura didn't flinch. Had heard it before. They all had. Speed is your armor, was the lie the engineers told the brass. And the brass repeated until it became a chant, a doctrine, a coffin lid. There were no self-sealing fuel tanks in the Betty, no armor plating, no survival gear worth packing. Most gunners didn't even get parachutes. Not because they didn't ask, but because they didn't matter. If you were hit, you burned. If you burned, there wasn't time to fall. The sun peeked over the jungle just as props began their rotations. One by one, the engines howled. The bombers taxied, skipped down the runway. Into the sky they rose, fast, light, deadly silent, into the mouth of death, painted metallic green, and bolted together by optimism and dishonesty. In the radio silence of the climb, Nakamura took one last look back. The photo the gunner had taped to the wall fluttered slightly in the cabin draft. A woman kissing the air, frozen in time. She'd never know how her husband died, because when Bettys burned mid-air, they erased the truth with them. Approaching Guadalcanal, U.S. anti-air guns were already tracking them. Bettys flew low, nap of the earth tactics to gain surprise against radar and enemy fighters. But it meant they were flying even closer to every gun. As searchlights pierced the sky and scattered flak bloomed above and below, Red 7 banked in line, gaining speed for its torpedo drop. Then it happened. Not to them, to the unit ahead. Red 4 hit once in the fuselage. Detonation before descent. An inferno that disintegrated frame and men instantly. Not even debris, just shrapnel and memory. We barely saw it, Nakamura would later write in the margin of a letter never sent. One moment it flew. The next, we flew through what used to be them. And yet, they flew on, because orders don't grieve, they grind. Red 7 made its run, released its torpedo into the sea. It may or may not have hit, they never saw. Because as they banked hard for egress, Anti-air flak punctured the left wing. Fuel leaked, and fire followed. The gunner, the one with the photo. He tried to yell, tried to move, but the cabin was already burning. Nakamura didn't call for bailout. There was no out. As they fell, he caught one last glimpse from the port hatch. The sky glowing white-orange around him, the water coming fast. There was no explosion on contact because they had already burned before it could come. That night, only one Betty returned to Rabaul. Only one. Its fuselage smoking. Holes in the wings. Crew pale, burned, barely breathing. The rest? Filed as accepted loss. Tactical expense. One general even noted, the operation was 50% successful. Those men knew the cost, and they paid it. And somewhere, in a farmhouse outside Nagasaki, a woman held a child, unaware that her husband had burned through the air. Not because he failed, but because his nation gave him a bomber that traded metal for myth, speed for hope, and called it honor. They flew into the breaking point because no one else would. Southwest Pacific, early 1943. They came fast, then vanished faster. A squadron of P-38 Lightnings, sharp-nosed predators cruising at altitude, had picked up a trail of Betty bombers retreating toward their base near Bougainville. Radar had spotted them, but they moved low, skipping the cloud cover like insects dancing just above the tree line. The order was clear. Intercept, eliminate. No survivors. Captain Elwood Hart, 26 years old, squadron lead, was already banked left when the first shadow cut across his gun sight. Twin engines. Green-gray skin. No escort. No evasive action. Easy prey. But what happened next wasn't expected. His wingman lined up a shot, squeezed the trigger. A short burst. Controlled. Efficient. Barely a dozen rounds. The kind of tap that would normally shear a wing and send the plane spiraling down in smoke. Instead, it ignited. A single flash, white, then orange, then gone. Not down. Not crashing, just gone. A flying fortress turned to sparks before it even rolled. It didn't crash, Hart said into the radio. It disintegrated. It vanished. The rest of the squad shifted posture, unsure whether they had struck something volatile or if this was some twisted trap. But the enemy didn't return fire. They scattered. Another was clipped 20 minutes later. Same results. Another fireball. Another silent burial. But one Betty, just one, took a hit to the landing gear and dropped hard, trailing smoke. It nosed into the edge of a reef and skidded, buckling horribly, but didn't explode. For the first time, the Americans had a wreck to examine. The recovery team arrived before nightfall. The smell of engine oil and scorched insulation still hung in the air. Captain Hart himself helped search the wreckage. What they found was more than strange. It was disturbing. Skin thickness barely millimeters thick, panels loose enough to bend with a boot. No steel underlayer, no reinforcement around the cockpit, no bulletproof glass, not even shatter-resistant, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Just aluminum bladders, thin as sheet metal. Someone ran fingers across the fuselage and looked back at Hart. This thing's built like a soda can. Hart frowned. He had trained under doctrine that assumed enemy aircraft were better. Stronger, if not faster. The German Heinkels were structurally dense. The Italian SM-79s weren't fast, but they'd take a pounding. But this? This flew at 600 kilometers an hour, could carry torpedoes, and yet no armor. No plan B. How many enemy had they fought thinking they were tactical threats? When in reality they'd been flying explosives held together by airspeed and prayer? They turned over notes, reports, photographed every inch. Back at base, the intelligence summary would later read, aircraft structurally optimized for range, no regard for survivability, confirmed vulnerable to minimal impact, recommend minimal resource allocation for suppression. Initial contact, Chaz confirmed kill. Hart didn't like the way that sounded. Confirmed kill sounded clean, easy, almost clinical. But when he closed his eyes, he could still see that first Betty as it lit up. Men inside it turning into fire before they even had time to scream. This wasn't efficiency. It was waste. Clear. Deliberate. Strategic. Waste. They'd built a bomber that only lived if it was never touched. And if it was, its crew became nothing but names. No one would ever recover. What the Americans discovered that day was not a tactical advantage. It was a grave lesson in philosophy. The Betty wasn't just vulnerable. It had been designed vulnerable, and it flew because its government believed speed was honor and armor was cowardice. Solomon Islands, August 1943. The mission was routine. At least that's what command said. Drop payload on a U.S. supply convoy sheltering near Rendova. In and out, fast, clean, tactical. But Captain Raichiro Genda had stopped believing in routine months ago. His crew was all he had. 5 men, trained together, grown close in the deafening silence between flights. They played dice behind hangars and swapped stories over cans of dried rice. Some had families, others just letters folded too many times in their pockets. But today, as they walked to the plane, no one spoke because the silence had changed. They were flying in a Betty again, and everyone already knew what that meant. The aircraft, tail number 4271, was lighter than ever. No armor, no plated hatches, no backup systems, just fuel and hope. Genda sat in the cockpit, eyes scanning over a dashboard he had read 100 times. Everything was running fine, which only meant one thing. There was no reason for them to come home broken, except the way the plane was built. They reached their target zone without incident. Below them, thin, dark smudges of enemy ships nestled between jungle fingers. Convoy formation. Perfect lines. Exposed bellies. Genda gave the signal. They dropped altitude. Too low, a few meters. That's all it took. A single anti-aircraft burst tore through the portside wing. Then, flame. Not smoke. Not damage. Flame. Liquid. Roaring. Immediate. The kind of fire that doesn't spread. It consumes. The first screams came from the tail turret. Then the comms died. The cockpit turned into a furnace of glass and canvas. The wiring sparked above Genda's head like lighting in a cave. The co-pilot's hair caught fire before he could twist toward the hatch. Genda didn't hesitate, because hesitation was impossible. The escape hatches were small, poorly placed, blocked by heat and wreckage. No one moved for them. No one expected an exit. They all knew. Fire in a Betty meant the mission was over, even if the plane stayed in the sky. Genda reached over, hand on his co-pilot's shoulder, trying to hold him steady as he convulsed, struggling under burning cloth. Behind them, the bombardier screamed once before the sound was swallowed by ignition. Everything melted fast. Genda pushed the flight stick forward one last time, not as a tactical move, but as an act of willpower. If they were going to die, they would die facing the sea, not stalled in mid-air like forgotten prey. The Betty nosed down, trailing black sky behind it. From the American side, observers watched, stunned. They hadn't expected the Japanese pilot to keep flying. Not in that state. One Marine gunner wrote later in his report, "We hit him, and the thing lit up like a lantern, but it didn't fall right away. It kept going, like it was too proud to drop." Below the cockpit, the front fuselage collapsed inward. Genda, flesh burning off bone, kept one eye open. He didn't scream. He didn't announce anything to his crew. He just flew until the flames turned the controls to ash. And then 4271 hit the sea. Not in a dive, not in terror, but like a bird folding its wings in final silence. No survivors. 2 weeks later, debris from the wreck washed up along a beach on New Georgia Island. Among the ash and alloys was a mostly intact canister, charred but sealed. Inside, a scorched field diary belonging to First Officer Akira Aso, the co-pilot. Most pages were unreadable, but near the back, scrawled between blackened streaks of smoke damage, one passage survived. It read, "This design made us weapons, not men." The Americans salvaged part of the fuselage. They couldn't believe how thin the panels were. An intelligence officer ran his knife along the skin and said, "They handed these guys paper planes and told them to cut. Steel with it?" A technician looked across the wreckage and muttered, "This wasn't supposed to protect people. It was supposed to scare us before it exploded." But the most haunting realization wasn't technical. It was emotional. The Betty hadn't failed. It had done exactly what it was designed to do: fly fast, deliver. Payload burn with everyone inside before it could be captured. Speed was the armor, and fire was the legacy. In Tokyo, the remains of the squad were declared kamikaze in spirit, though the word had not yet existed operationally, because even before they were ordered to die, they were already flying on a one-way path written into blueprints. Their sacrifice wasn't valor. It wasn't shame. It was architecture. And in one final descent, wrapped in flames and silence, the crew that burned together left the truth smoldering behind them. Tokyo, 1946. Long after the final bomb fell, after the surrender, and after the silence settled across the Pacific for good, the questions began. Among American intelligence circles, a final analysis of recovered Japanese technology was quietly compiled. Aircraft, submarines, bomb casings, all dissected with surgical precision. But only one report bore a handwritten note in red ink across the cover: "Brilliant killing machine," for both sides. Inside, the official verdict on the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber carried no pride. No admiration, only quiet disbelief. The memo outlined a truth American pilots had suspected and Japanese crews had known: fuel tanks completely unprotected. No armor reinforcement on crew stations. Weak wing spar load tolerance. Extreme fire risk under even small caliber damage. The final summary read, "A strategic asset with long reach, but no survivability, optimized for mission success, not for aircrew return." Alineation scrawled in pencil beneath it, likely from a junior officer: "Tactical range achieved. Human cost accepted without comment." The numbers were staggering. Of the over 2,400 Bettys produced, fewer than 250 survived the war in flyable condition. Entire crews were routinely lost on first flights. In air battles above the Marianas and the Solomons, loss rates regularly exceeded 70%. This wasn't just operational risk. It was design-induced sacrifice. In post-war detention, Japanese airmen and officers, now prisoners of a war they were no longer serving, began to reflect, not just on what they'd done, but on what carried them into battle. Captain Isamu Kojima, a former Betty pilot held in a POW camp in the Philippines, told an American translator, "The plane was not cursed, it was obedient, faithful. It flew its mission. It kept its promise, but it never, not once, protected us." Another air mechanic, hands calloused from years spent hugging aluminum skin and torquing open what little protection the plane offered, gave this in his interview: "We envied the Americans' armor. They had a chance. We had speed." Among many Japanese veterans, the Betty earned a tragic nickname that never appeared in official records: Hai Uzora, the flying crematorium. It was whispered on airfields, painted under breath, written on the edge of toolboxes with grease pencils that could be wiped clean before inspections, was a superstition born not from cowardice, but from certainty. Every mission was a silent gamble, one gunner wrote in his diary, not because of what we would face, but because of what we were flying in. Engineers, too, felt it. Not all. Some clung to post-war reassurances about intentionality, but others confessed, long after the fire had stopped, that they had known. Mitsubishi designer Kiyoshi Ozawa, in an unrecorded but documented meeting with U.S. analysts in 1948, said, "We gave the plane to the war the way we were asked to. Fast, powerful, long-ranged. But I never forget the day I saw one fall out of the sky, vanish in flame, and I realized I had signed those blueprints with someone else's blood." The Americans didn't gloat. How could they? They had flinched each time a Betty exploded before parachutes could be seen. They had watched again and again as death struck long before wreckage hit the water. They had assumed, at first, that the Japanese had built a ghost plane, a demon in the sky. But now they understood. The demon hadn't been built to take life. It had been built not to save it. By the end of the analysis, the U.S. Navy and Army Air Force issued a quiet advisory to training academies and airfield engineering schools. The G4M serves as an example of the limits of tactical design without survivability. Range does not compensate for the loss of every man on board. The Betty never got a true monument, only fragments, in museums, in rusted-out wreckage along island cliffs, and in the silence of those who returned without their crews, carrying the burden of brilliance forged in blindness. Their war was not just fought in the sky, it was lost in the hangar, before they ever left the runway. By the time peace dropped its last curtain over the Pacific, the Betty bomber had vanished from the skies, not just in use, but in memory. It wasn't listed among the legendary aircraft of World War II. It wasn't displayed in victory parades. It wasn't rebuilt or celebrated or immortalized, because the world doesn't carve statues for tools that failed their own men. Instead, the Mitsubishi G4M found its way into textbooks, not as an innovation, but as a warning. Post-war analysis by both Allied and Japanese engineers turned the Betty into a case study, not of tactical failure, but of ideological blindness. Japan had achieved its technical goal, a twin-engine bomber with almost twice the range of its contemporaries, high-speed delivery potential, large offensive capacity for torpedoes and bombs. But the cost? No self-sealing fuel tanks, no armor, protection, minimal exit clearance, lethal, fuel placement. Crew loss on impact ratio nearing 100%. It delivered death, but only toward both directions. In the classrooms of modern military academies, its diagram is opened under a quiet heading: Combat Aircraft Vulnerability, Lessons in Strategic Overreach. It's not presented like a famous fighter. It's displayed the way a coroner might arrange a broken skull, a blueprint, not of power, but of high-velocity failure. Underneath hangs a quote instructors often repeat: "Design like you'll fly in it," because someone did fly in it, thousands. Did. Most never came back, not because they weren't brave, not because they weren't trained, but because the machine didn't care. In Japan, what little remains of recovered Bettys sits quietly in rust, mostly untouched. There are no dedicated museums, no cultural shrines framed around it, because no one wants to remember dying in something that never tried to protect them. Ironically, its creators were never punished. Not officially. They had served their country's request too well. They made exactly what they were asked to make: a weapon of reach. But in post-war interviews, when the cameras were off, regret dripped heavier than oil ever did. One engineer, who requested anonymity decades later, said, "The Betty was fast, it was sleek, it was tactical, and it was a death trap." As technology advanced, the Betty remained locked in time. It taught nothing with pride, only with pain. Air forces across the globe began adjusting aircraft doctrine in its shadow, emphasize crew survivability. Secondary. Exits must never be secondary in function. Fuel. Management is not just performance, it is life. Never sacrifice armor for ambition without rechecking who you're truly protecting. Military historians now echo a universal thought, that the G4M was not a bomber made for a modern war. It was made for a first strike victory that never came. And when the war stretched longer than anyone imagined, the Betty became one of the first machines to prove doctrine must evolve faster than pride. Because pride builds beautiful things, but pride doesn't heal, burns. It doesn't pull bodies from wreckage, and it cannot fly a man safely home when everything has gone wrong. The legacy of the Betty isn't in its range, it's in its silence, in its wrecks, in its diagrams, and every maintenance officer who reviews emergency exit clearances, and every pilot who questions a missing panel of armor, is still listening to what the Betty had to scream as it burned. The Betty wasn't just a bomber, it was a blueprint soaked in ideology, a burning philosophy, painted with pride and powered by denial. It soared on promise. It struck with speed. But when it was hit, even once, it didn't fall. It vanished. Not because the enemy was cruel, but because the designers were convinced they didn't need to protect what could outrun death. They were wrong. It was fast enough to kill, but not enough to live. And in that margin, in that fatal gamble, thousands of lives were lost before they ever had a chance to escape their own aircraft. If war is a contest of weapons, it's also a contest of ideas, and this was a weapon built by the wrong idea, and an idea that said precision matters more than people. Speed matters more than survival. Victory matters more than return. Don't remember the Betty because it changed the war. We remember it because it held on to a lie, and men paid for it with flame. Subscribe to War II Diaries for more stories of weapons that weren't just forged in steel, but in strategy, ego, and sometimes silence. These aren't just stories of war. They're tests of conscience, written in fire, and passed down to history with scorch marks still visible.